thank you very much. We're just about to get underway here. I hope you all enjoyed your lunch. Thank you to the Hilton staff for their service. So we have an expert panel with us today. We have Allie Renison, who's the IoD's head of EU and trade policy, someone who has devoted an enormous amount of time and energy to Northern Ireland issues over the last couple of years. We have the extremely well-connected Dr Katy Hayward from Queen's, who's done an amazing job explaining Brexit detail to a wide range of audiences, while also leading research into the impact of the Brexit process on border communities. We have Frankie Devlin, who leads KPMG's Indirect Tax Services Group in Belfast. He's over 20 years' experience providing UK VAT advice to clients across many sectors, and the new Brexit deal has a major VAT component, so there may be lots of tricky technical questions for him. And finally, we have Adrian O'Connell, who's partner at Tughans Solicitors, where he heads the contracts and technology practice. Before we get into the panel session, Katy and Allie are going to give us a bit of an introduction. So first I'll call on Dr Hayward to tell us what has just happened over the last week or so, what happens next, and what the deal might mean for Northern Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Last night I was speaking on a panel with an unusual audience, and we were asked to make final remarks and to make predictions, and all I could predict was uncertainty and flux. And I felt very uncomfortable doing that, and I was determined to do something different today. So I will try and say some things that we know, the known knowns, but unfortunately, all of those sort of known knowns head continually into the unknown, and so I will be pointing ultimately to the unknown and to uncertainty. But before we get to that point, I just wanted to sort of say a little bit about how we got here, and to go a little bit further back than you might have expected, i.e. A little bit further back than last week. And the first thing to bear in mind, of course, is the significance of the joint report in all of this. And I don't need to rehearse the details of that, you're very familiar with it. But in December 2017, the reiteration of the commitments of the UK and the EU to avoiding a hard border, importantly to protecting North-South cooperation, and of course, to upholding the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. This is really what got us where we are today. And in that joint report, there were 3 scenarios in which those commitments would be upheld to the future relationship between the UK and the EU. Secondly, specific solutions for Northern Ireland. And then thirdly, full alignment with the rules of the Single Market and Customs Union for the UK. Now, the backstop is best understood as coming under that third scenario. And this is why people were so resistant to it in some quarters in Westminster, because it really was about the UK in effect committing to full alignment with the rules of with the customs union rules, but also, of course, in many ways, to the rules of the single market, because that's what we had in the white paper from the UK government. So the backstop falls under that scenario. What we have with Johnson's deal is actually the second scenario. So this is in that we have specific solutions for Northern Ireland, and these are very unusual and very rare solutions being put forward, something that is very bespoke. And this is partly why we are in this particular bind, because in effect, in many ways, without trying to use dramatic language, but it is a specific solution that sort of hives off or deals with Northern Ireland in a very different way to the rest of the UK. So it essentially removes the hindrance, if you want to put it that way, the hindrance to a harder Brexit, or the obstacles to a hard Brexit. And this is why when we're trying to think about the consequences for Northern Ireland and for businesses in Northern Ireland, we know that those consequences could actually be quite severe, because although we have in this deal, we're managing to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland, of course, all of that uncertainty comes to the fore about the East-West scenario, and so much of the significance of that East-West relationship will depend on the future UK-EU deal. Ali, I'm sure, is going to talk in more detail about that, so I won't go into the details of what the deal says. Instead, I just want to focus a little bit on the parliamentary procedure and what we can expect as far as we can predict, and the kind of what's going on at the moment. So first and foremost, we know that the timetable for passing the withdrawal agreement bill has been scuppered somewhat. And I think it's worth asking ourselves why it is that the government is so worried about parliamentary scrutiny. I mean, in some ways, it wanted to get to the 31st of October with a deal and get out. And we know that that's been a big priority. So you can justify it in those terms. It's very difficult to justify in any other terms. If you're wanting properly scrutinized, dependable legislation, that doesn't make much sense at all. So why is it that the government was rushing to push it forward so quickly? And why does scrutiny worry the government? Well, the more you scrutinize it, the more the trade-offs in that deal become obvious. And in so doing, it can create a situation in which you have majorities being created for serious amendments to that deal. Now, there's a limit to what amendments can be made because they can't undermine the basis of the agreement itself. So if they kind of fundamentally change the nature of that withdrawal agreement, then they're simply not passable. They can't go forward. And I'll talk a little bit about the amendments in a minute. Why else does scrutiny worry the government on this? Well, the economic costs of this deal might become more apparent the more time we have to consider it. So a recent report from the UK and Changing Europe linked in with the LSE really demonstrated that Johnson's deal is significantly worse than May's deal. And the reason for this is quite obvious, because Great Britain will have no customs union with the EU, no level playing field arrangements, and a limited, or in fact quite possibly no free trade agreement at the end of the time period. And that short implementation transition period is a grave concern, I think. So according to this report, the Brexit proposal from Johnson could reduce UK GDP per capita 10 years after Brexit, between 2.3% and 7% compared to remaining in the EU, whereas May's deal was between 1.9% and 5.5%. All of this, of course, is better than a no deal, but not significantly so. So this could become more apparent the more time we have to scrutinize this. Also coming apparent could be the contradictory nature of the government's promises about that future. So from the one hand, telling Labour MPs that the government will maintain EU standards on workers' rights, whilst promising hard Brexiteers there'll be no EU constraints on UK competitiveness. I mean, those promises are contradictory. They can't stand together, and that would become more apparent as time goes on. Amongst all of this, the DUP still plays a very significant role. And their wish and determination, in fact, to minimize differences between Great Britain and Northern Ireland in the future relationship with the EU can make a difference to the likelihood of certain amendments passing. So the possibility of them supporting an amendment on the customs union, for example. So in some ways, what happens in these amendments means that the future UK-EU relationship is up for grabs in a way that it hasn't been before. Just to go very quickly through the process of the withdrawal agreement bill. So of course, it did pass the second reading by 30 votes, quite significantly. But even though it has been approved, I really wouldn't overestimate the likelihood of it meaning that the deal is definitely going to get passed. It certainly makes it more likely than May's ever was, but, and this is true given that the Queen's speech was also approved. But nonetheless, we have a long way to go yet. So it still can be directed at a third reading. And of course, the whole intention now, including of those who helped pass the withdrawal agreement, is to amend it. So that was the sort of ulterior motive for many people voting for it, who might actually fundamentally disagree with core things in that withdrawal agreement. So the time is very compressed anyway for negotiating compromises. So we can expect majorities being formed for amendments that will try and be as effective as possible. Just to sort of condense things down a bit, essentially, we'd have to have the third reading after the committee and the report stage, and this is the opportunity for MPs to approve or reject the bill as amended in these stages. This could be the critical moment. That's the end of the House of Lords procedure at that point. Then we move, the House of Commons, then we move to the House of Lords. And that lovely thing called ping pong comes back into play. And the Lords sees itself as a constitutional guardian. it will inevitably make changes to this withdrawal agreement bill that have constitutional significance. So even if a second referendum amendment is ruled out by the House of Commons, not voted on, the House of Lords may well introduce it and may well pass it. Then it goes back to the Commons to approve, reject, or amend what the House of Lords has decided upon, and then we have that ping pong. And we know from the EU withdrawal bill from last year that ping pong can actually result in quite significant changes being made to the final act. So only when the bill has been negotiated through those stages, Commons and Lords, will the UK be able to formally ratify the withdrawal treaty with the EU. And on those amendments, political focus will be on the possibility of a second referendum. Even with DUP support, which is on and off in terms of the rumours, the numbers do look very tight for this. A successful referendum amendment would be disruptive, just to state the obvious. It would prevent ratification of the deal, of course. It would also require the EU to grant a significantly longer extension than hoped for, so at least 6 months. And it would need, essentially, a new government to get the referendum bill through. Because Johnson really would not be able to accept a second referendum without splitting his party. So an election could well be triggered if we have that second referendum amendment being approved. It's much more likely there will be a majority for an amendment committing the UK to stay in the EU customs union permanently, given that it's come within a few votes of success previously. Bear this in mind, if we do have an election, and that is the most likely outcome from this, and Johnson has a majority, he could tear up that commitment as soon as he gets back into number 10. So there'll be a lot of fuss and bother about this customs union amendment, even if it gets through, but it could well be dumped pretty quickly afterwards and leave us pretty much in the same position. There may also be amendments to the issue of consent, as the Northern Ireland Assembly could give it. So where are we at now? So the news this morning, I don't know what the news has been since we started lunch. But anyway, the news this morning is the EU is saying that it will delay a decision on extension until the decision on an election is being made, i.e. on Monday. The problem, of course, is that it's not likely to be resolved at that point. Now, the EU's extension basically can fall under four, the EU's extension choice can come under four categories. Bear in mind, it has to be a unanimous decision. There is an outside possibility that one member state could veto that extension. And then it really comes down to back to the UK Parliament. Does it revoke Article 50, as we know it can do unilaterally, or does it go for no deal? Another option is to give a very short extension. As we know, Macron has been encouraging or thinking about advocating happens. I don't think a short extension of a matter of a few weeks would give us enough time to see the withdrawal agreement through for the reasons I've just been explaining. So we'd possibly end up in stalemate. It could offer a very long extension. We couldn't expect that extension to be longer than June 2020 because of the procedures in the EU with regards to its finance framework, etc., budget framework. So that could be up to June, but maybe that too would lead us into stalemate because it takes the pressure off the decision being made in the House of Commons. So currently, the most likely outcome is a 3-month extension. But as I say, it's still yet to make that decision. And then finally, the thing on the table most immediately and most likely to happen at some point is an election. So because of the Fixed Terms Parliament Act, this is really kicking into play now. So a general election can only be held before the end of the 5-year term if two-thirds, if we have under two situations, so 2/3 of MPs voting in favour of dissolution. This will have to have happened 25 working days before an election. So the latest this decision has to be made is by the 5th of November. We know it looks likely that Labour will abstain on this vote. So that doesn't, on Monday, so it doesn't look like that's the way the election is going to happen. The alternative is that the government is defeated through a no confidence vote. and no alternative administration is formed. The latest date of having that no confidence vote to try and get an election for the 12th of December was a couple of days ago. So essentially, we're looking to a situation in which this may well, if we do get an election through a vote of no confidence, that may well take us, in effect, beyond the 31st of January before we have a properly functioning Parliament able to pass a withdrawal agreement. Another alternative is a one-line bill to overrule the Fixed Term Parliament Act, and that need only be passed by a simple majority. But the risk then is you get, surprise, surprise, amendments being put to that bill. So all of this means a very destabilizing situation within the House of Commons. I just wanted to conclude by thinking about, well, what the prospects are for those two things. So essentially, I think we have a stalemate at the moment in the House of Commons because you have both the Tories and the Labour Party wanting a ballot of some sort. They want to go back to the people, want to go to the people, but they want to do it in very different ways because they think they will get different outcomes. So the Tories want an election because they think they'll win, and the Labour Party want a referendum because they think they'll win. Well, some people in the Labour Party would be happy with a Remain vote. So this is an interesting tension there. Let's look at the data to see whether they're right in being so confident. So the Tories want an election, and they are sitting at about 36% satisfaction rates in the opinion polls, support rates, in the opinion polls, compared to Labour, which is about 24%. The Lib Dems on 18%, and Brexit Party on 11%. According to Ipsos Mori's leadership satisfaction survey and ratings, Jeremy Corbyn is on the lowest net score of any opposition leader since their series began in 1977. So you can see why the Tories are quite happy with that. But, and this is quite a big but actually, satisfaction in the government is also extremely low. Just 14% are satisfied with the performance of the government. And Johnson's ratings started off low for an UPM, and they're continuing to drop on many criteria. So things can't necessarily predict a strong Tory win there. And then on a referendum, the latest poll put the Remainers ahead of Leavers by 6 points. And Remain has consistently been ahead of Leave for the past 18 or 20 months. But the poll of polls, which gathers the data from Delta Poll, Kantar, Survation, BMG, etc., as John Curtis did the latest analysis of that. And I'm going to conclude by giving you the results of that poll of polls, and that is that Remain is on 52% and Leave is on 48%. Thank you.
Katy, thank you very much. Before we get to questions, Allie is going to give us her initial view on what this deal might mean for Northern Ireland business. Allie, thank you.
Thank you. No pressure. Thank you very much, everyone. I am aware I am absolutely not dressed for the weather, but I have been in a different city almost every other day since I took my holiday in September, and this was all I had left, effectively. Just flown in from Yorkshire, and it was interesting. You know, a lot of other parts of the UK, and we are a UK-wide organisation, the IoD itself, with many different branches and regions and nations. And a lot of the questions that I tend to get in other parts of the UK are, sort of some questions about getting on with it, some questions about is it worth getting on with it, but often need to sort of spend time, and it's a valuable exercise explaining why things are not as clear-cut for Northern Ireland as they may be for the rest of the UK, particularly in the context of this deal. It's worth saying, actually, that when the revised deal came out, we were somewhat circumspect. I think there was sort of relief expressed at there being a breakthrough, but we wanted to look at the detail. And that sort of really, in terms of our positioning since that point, has been a big eyebrow raise at what it means for Northern Ireland, because there are so many question marks. I probably won't be able to answer all the question marks because, as Katy referenced, it really depends on where we get to with the future relationship, but I'll try to pick through some of those. areas. And just listening to Katy go through her remarks, I was thinking that perhaps people in the room and Northern Ireland generally can take some kind of comfort that the rest of the UK is now going through what it feels like to have a completely non-functioning government, not to mention Parliament. So we are now very much living the reality that's been here for the last couple of years. Obviously, the point about why, not just in terms of the content, I think the deal is worth the scrutiny is because obviously it's no longer a backstop. It is no longer a contingency measure. This is effectively the beginning of the starting point for Northern Ireland's relationship, both with the rest of the EU and the UK going forward. It's no longer something that both sides were, as they put it, in respect of the backstop in the previous agreement, hoping to avoid and seeking to avoid by a brand new sort of series of arrangements and free trade arrangements. And it's worth saying, actually, just casting our mind back to when the original withdrawal agreement and contained the original protocol, the backstop, came out, we were fairly clear that, if push came to shove, we would prefer to see the transition extended rather than see that implemented, because we knew that even under that deal, there were going to be a whole host of questions in respect of Northern Ireland's relationship with the rest of the UK. And I think that question mark, which Katy referenced, is going to come to the fore very, very quickly. The fact that you need to have a notification request if you want to extend the transition by the middle of next year. The government, if it is still in place, would have to make, within the context of this deal, if it goes through, a decision fairly quickly about whether it thinks it's going to get that future relationship sorted. I have dispensed with being polite about that. I think it's nonsensical, based on the experience of the last 3 years, to think that if this deal goes through in the next few months, that we're going to be in any kind of state not only to have that future relationship negotiated, particularly because of the complex arrangements in respect of what the joint committee, which I'll come back to, is set up and being tasked to do, but also because, as we always stress to politicians, I know that sometimes, depending on which quarter politically you're speaking to, people aren't enamored with business and business organizations talking about time scales and time constraints and needs for time. But really, I think what this comes down to, and I tend to stress this at every turn, is that it's not about trying to drag out the process, as I think some politicians think we're talking about and trying to do, but more about making sure that whenever an agreement is in place, that you're giving businesses, the end users, the people will have to interact with this first and foremost before any politician or any other stakeholder have the time to actually adjust and implement and react to what that new arrangements are going to be. And the analogy I often draw is, if you look at trade agreements around the world across time, even something like cutting tariffs, those often, particularly in the sensitive areas, will get 2, 5, 10, even longer sort of 20-year time phase-out periods. So there are, when it comes to actually trade agreements that are supposed to benefit people, a beneficial change, as it were, people tend to have that opportunity to actually have the time to adjust. And so what we are trying to make sure we get through to politicians of all colors and stripes is that there needs to be that time to actually adjust. So even if the agreement were to be sewn up between the UK and the EU at the end of next year, that would give you virtually no time to actually adjust thereafter. And I think that's been a very relevant issue as we go through the last sort of 6 to 9 months of no-deal planning and the noise around that, because obviously, I think a lot of people outside of business don't have any concept of the fact that, people can't just prepare for everything in advance without knowing the full detail of what those arrangements are going to be. And I sort of, in press release after press release, kept trying to draw people and the politicians, the government's attention to the fact that, it's great to talk up a good game about the need to, up your planning, but you can't do that in a sense that basically announces the plans for whether it's the management of the land border or the no-deal tariffs 2 weeks before an exit date. That's just not acceptable, effectively. And so we've been trying to deliver that message to government that in order to help businesses prepare, we need a lot more from them in terms of the information that businesses need effectively to plan, because at last glance, I think when I looked, all we still have for Northern Ireland in respect of what a no-deal scenario would entail for managing trade across the land border, at least, is a press release from March, the middle of March, which kind of set out in theory its ideas, but nothing really concrete for end users to engage with. And so they can't really expect businesses in Northern Ireland, particularly those who are trading across that land border, to be in a position to be completely ready ahead of time. So we're always trying to sort of strike that message in a balanced way to make sure that politicians understand this isn't about dragging out processes, but making sure you're giving people enough time and information to actually adjust, and that's what business tends to do best. Turning back to the deal, when it came out, and I mentioned that it sort of moved from being a contingency option that no one wanted to have to use, supposedly, to basically the starting point for Northern Ireland. I think one of the things that business and business groups have faced challenge-wise, in respect of the politics over the last 3 years, is trying to make informed choices about what counterfactuals were. I mean, that was quite relevant throughout the referendum campaign. It wasn't just about what you did or you didn't like about the EU. It was what was the sort of relevant counterfactual. How could you weigh that up? And so when you look at it from the perspective of this particular agreement, the counterfactual being, well, if this is now the starting point, do we have all the full sort of raft of information we need? And what is that counterfactual if it's not this deal? Politicians of many different colors and stripes were saying to us, this is, no deal is not the counterfactual. It's not the only choice, and we're going to take it off the table. I have to say it's impossible to take no deal off the table unless you're stopping the whole thing. And that's something that the opposition, I think, needs to hear the message that, that while business would welcome that trying to move to take it off the table, ultimately there is only one way of doing that, and that is cancelling Brexit altogether, which some people may have a strong view on. But in terms of business looking at deals and trying to understand what the relevant counterfactual is when they're weighing up those choices, it's very important to understand that. I think in light of the legislation that went through in the last few weeks and months that was trying to at least take the 31st of October as a potential no-deal exit off the table, potentially that made, I think, weighing up the need for scrutiny for this deal slightly easier, because we knew that there was a strong possibility, effectively, that there was going to be that extension. But regardless, looking at the actual details of the deal when it came back, and I'm sure many people in the room who may be at sort of business groups or members of other business groups will sort of have some sympathy that, very often people want your reaction like that, and you haven't gotten to read all the details yet. So I think that's why we had sort of, welcomed the breakthrough, but wanted to really scrutinize. And the more you looked at it, the more questions there were. And the reason that, as opposed to, I think, under the backstop, under the previous withdrawal agreement, we knew this is something that people were trying to move away from and not have to implement. This was now the starting point for Northern Ireland, and we felt that it deserved the scrutiny, that it was warranted in this situation. And looking at the actual contours of it, particularly in respect of, I am not, if I'm completely honest, 100% certain that I understand how looking at the dual tariff idea, and I won't go into too much details here, but the idea that basically the UK and the EU will remain in separate, distinct customs territories. Northern Ireland will be part of the UK's customs territory, but there will be different tariffs applied, particularly if the UK starts at going off and changing its tariffs through trade agreements with other countries. How that is going to work in terms of Northern Ireland businesses being able to access preferences under both sets of tariffs, particularly as the two may start to pursue different paths in terms of their trade agreements. The argument is that that will stop any need for kind of processes to be administered anywhere at or near the land border. And Katie and myself were members of the government's technical panel that were looking at alternative arrangements for that land border. And I think, if I'm honest, I think that was a valuable exercise insofar as it really kind of forced ministers around the table to sit and discuss with businesses what was realistic and what was not. So for that, I thought I was very grateful to have that opportunity. Looking ahead, I was looking at some of the questions that were submitted before this lunch. How will the customs contracts work? Effectively, basically, the EU has concerns, as any other country would. I was going through customs, going back to Washington the other day, and something was up with my passport, and they asked what I was doing over in the UK, and I explained I was working on Brexit, and they said, well, how is that thing with Northern Ireland going? And I basically said, the government the UK government wants to have different tariffs to the EU, and this is, parking the regulatory issues for a minute, which are actually, I would say, even more significant if you didn't have that alignment with respect to the land border, that the UK government was hoping to sort of have different tariffs from the EU, but didn't want any kind of controls near the border, and he started laughing, which I think gives you an idea of actually the way, this is really a departure from the norm, what the government is hoping to do, and we should bear that in mind. But effectively, in respect of this deal, if the UK and the EU are not following following the same tariffs on imported goods. Obviously, the EU wants to make sure, as any other country would, that the goods coming into its market are not getting basically duty-free treatment unfairly, particularly if they're coming in from other parts of the world. And so that's the reason why, looking at the deal effectively, the Joint Committee, which is something that will govern the architecture and the implementation of this deal going forward, because a lot has to be decided at that next stage, which goods which may actually not stay in Northern Ireland but go on to the rest of the EU are at risk and would have to pay the EU tariff if it's higher than the UK one, leading to a sort of potentially complicated rebate system. But in terms of understanding which of those goods would apply, where the dual tariff system would apply, really a lot of that is effectively punted into the next stage. So there's a lot of question marks around how it will work, how it will be integrated into the future relationship negotiations. There are ways, I think it's important to stress that a lot of what is in that agreement around customs, around VAT, is simply stating what would happen, absent any sort of future trade relationship, and that potentially that future trade relationship may pick up, may in fact negate or streamline some of the need for that internal controls and extra documentary requirements on GB and I-trade and vice versa. But the answer is effectively a lot of that rests on the next stage, and I think the politicians from Northern Ireland, certainly those who are represented in the House of Commons, are looking at this probably from the perspective of, is the lack of information a deal breaker, or can I have enough assurances that we will sort all this out in the next stage? And that is a tough decision, I think, for them to make. Just looking sort of with an eye ahead, one of the issues that I think sometimes when government looks at this and sometimes doesn't necessarily have Northern Ireland in mind, or vice versa, when it has Northern Ireland in mind but isn't thinking about other commitments it's made down the line. If you cast your eye back to one of the speeches that the Chancellor made at the Conservative Party conference, he talked about having a sort of audit of EU rules that were particularly complicated and particularly burdensome for business. And I think while on one level that's welcome and shouldn't just be sort of limited to the EU by any means either, what that does and where that sort of rubs up against the withdrawal agreement and the Irish protocol is effectively, we know that some of the EU rules that the UK, and in this particular instance GB, because Northern Ireland would have to keep following certain rules that they are obliged to under the current protocol. If the UK were to, for example, change or get rid of the chemicals system that we have derives from EU legislation, were to set up its own one, which potentially would probably have to happen under a no-deal scenario because our chemicals regulator is completely European at the moment, then it starts to sort of, I think, rub up against the Northern Irish protocol insofar as if you have basically GB having a completely different set of regulatory provisions around chemicals and Northern Ireland is still aligned to the EU one, you start to see over time how that potential for regulatory drift could actually accelerate. So it's important, I think, and we're trying to deliver that message to government that it has to sort of think with both hands instead of sort of putting Northern Ireland in one box and applying sort of different view to the UK in this particular area, meaning GB going forward. So I think what we're trying to encourage government to do at the moment, particularly in respect of what extra safeguards, certainly in protections Northern Ireland would need, not only in respect of its agreement with the EU going forward, but in terms of its unilateral commitments. If you remember, some of you may recall that after the original backstop sort of was proposed under the original withdrawal agreement, the government under Theresa May made a series of unilateral standalone commitments to say that effectively Great Britain, UK, would voluntarily dynamically align in those areas that Northern Ireland was obliged to under the previous backstop, should it ever come into effect. And as far as we know, that no longer applies. So we are working with government to try and sort of come to a series of proposals that would help safeguard that market if we get to a position that this withdrawal agreement is implemented. So rest assured that we are certainly doing our bit to try and make sure that regardless of the scenario that Northern Ireland's place in the internal market and with respect to the Irish Republic and the rest of the EU is safeguarded as far as possible. So I'm happy to take any questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I could ask all of the panel just to join us on the stage, so Allie, Katy, Frankie and Adrian. We will have a roaming mic, so if you have questions, just stick your hand up, wait for the mic to arrive, identify yourself, let us know who you are, and ask your questions. We also have some questions submitted in advance, and I will start with them. We'll hopefully have about 45 minutes for this, and we will try to get round as many people as possible. I'm just going to start with a very straightforward and practical question from Hazel Kincaid from Dalradian and Gould. And this is probably for Ali. So far as we know, in terms of what's been published in this deal, what documentation will be needed for goods moving NI to GB and GB to NI? What will the paperwork be, so far as we know?
Well, the one that's probably gotten everyone's attention the last week is the entry and exit summary declarations, and that arises effectively because Northern Ireland, under this protocol, would still be applying effectively the EU's customs legislation, and the rest of the UK would not have that obligation to do so. And therefore, in the absence of that alignment, not so much on tariffs, but on the legislation governing customs, you effectively would need to have that entry and exit summary declaration. It's basically almost like a movement certificate.
So this is NI to GB?
This is NI to GB. And then obviously the argument being that it would potentially have to apply in reverse as well. Now, it's worth saying that, as I mentioned earlier, that on that kind of customs side, I think VAT is a whole other ballgame. There's VAT, most of the people I've spoken to in respect to VAT think basically don't have any answers at the moment and say it completely depends on what that future relationship is going to be going forward. There is a potential to waive that if the UK were to, as Norway did, align to various bits of the EU's customs code, but because the UK hasn't made that commitment at this stage under that protocol, that's what would certainly apply. And potentially, I think it depends on, in terms of the, if you look at the kind of 4-year potential rolling consent issue, it depends on how far the UK would diverge or not continue to follow EU regulations. At the moment, under the protocol, the government has said that subject to the consent of the Assembly in the simple majority way that it's laid out, that it would continue to align to manufactured goods and agri-food products. So you're potentially looking at some regulatory certificates as well.
So this is GB, NI, or both?
Probably, for the regulatory perspective, it's probably, let me get my direction of travel right. So it would be probably GB to NI.
Yeah. So we know there'll be a new piece of paper for NI goods going to GB, but we think that should be pretty straightforward, as the Brexit Secretary has hinted at. But we don't know for certain.
I'm not sure you can make that guarantee. Effectively, the government, and I think that if they had wanted to, the government could have, a lot of their problem with the backstop as it was conceived of was about keeping your tariffs aligned to the EU's under that contingency scenario. I think if it had wanted to, the government could have said that, fine, we are not going to keep our tariffs aligned, but we will continue to implement the Union Customs Code as it develops. And I should say that the government, the UK as a whole, is already starting to implement parts of that UCC, but I suppose it didn't want to make that dynamic commitment, and it was sort of put into the next stage of the future relationship.
Okay, so then in GB to NI, you will need, there'll have to be a full customs declaration, so far as we're aware. So far as we're aware,
but that obviously will depend on what the future relationship negotiations are between the UK and the EU as a whole.
And on the regulatory side then, you would, particularly on food products,
products of animal origin,
yeah. So that would mean new checks on meat, dairy, fish coming from GB to NI, and that would have to come with an export health certificate as well, would it?
Yeah, if the UK is not going to align on SPS and product of animal origin regulations of the EU, then yes. And it's interesting, I think particularly from an agri-food and regulatory perspective, the best way of understanding what that might look like actually is to go back to the original withdrawal agreement, because that was already provided for under that backstop arrangements. I think there's a lot more, though, basically holes to be filled in under this protocol in the next stage than you had in respect of the previous withdrawal agreement.
Because we know, for example, say New Zealand have an agri-food deal where only 1% of consignments need to be checked.
Yeah.
So you would hope that in the medium term at least we could get to that position, given we start from a position of high alignment.
Yeah, I think that starting point of alignment people don't give enough credit to as being important. However, it does not sort of, without that, absent that future relationship commitment around alignment for agri-food, it becomes an issue. I do believe that Ireland and the UK may have signed actually a mutual recognition deal on recognizing each other's vets, but that's more in respect of dealing with any contingency issues for the land border.
Yeah, and just in terms of this, this exit certificate, which you will need NI to GB. The question people have been asking me all week is, why do you need this? Because why would the EU particularly care about what is leaving its territory? Surely that's a matter for the UK. And the issue all along has been we were told unfettered access, the clear understanding was no new processes. So this isn't a UK process, it's an EU process to say we want this form. Why do they need it?
I think there's a couple of reasons there. One, it's around the UK not making the alignment on EU customs legislation. Two, it's also worth remembering that the reason that exit and entry summary declarations were brought in under EU customs law happened after 9/11. That's when it came in, and basically because Norway, which even though it's not in any customs union with the EU, didn't want to have to deal with this, it basically voluntarily decided to commit to aligning to that part of EU customs law. So it could be waived in theory. The third part of that also potentially interacts with, I don't think it's 100% certain whether we know that the UK stops, certainly, or Northern Ireland has no intrastat record. So at the moment there is documentation, but it's not a customs declaration, because at the moment, when you're in the single market, when you're in the EU and its VAT area, they're technically not called imports and exports, they're acquisitions and dispatches. So the uncertainty around how that sort of will work in terms of, and usually most times when you can have an export, you can waive the sort of entry and exit sort of summary declarations that we're talking about, but usually you have a customs declaration in its stead. That's what Norway has. So the question mark becomes, effectively, I think the UK is going to have to ask for a massive derogation from EU customs law if it doesn't want to continue aligning to the Union Customs Code.
And Frankie, we were talking a little bit earlier about what this new form might amount to, and then also the other question I maybe have for you is there likely to be any new VAT paperwork required for trade in either direction?
Yeah. I mean, again, as Ali said, there's a lot of uncertainty and we need a lot of clarification. But, I mean, obviously, Barclay was asked that question the other day and he flip-flopped on it. He referred to this exit summary declaration. So I suppose my first point would be, is that actually what it is? That's what he said, exit summary declaration. Or did he actually mean something different? I mean, an exit summary declaration at the moment is just part and parcel of a customs declaration. So it's, if you had an exit summary declaration on its own, it doesn't tell you an awful lot, because it's more to do with protection and security of goods rather than commodity codes and details, which are really what you need for goods moving across from maybe one EU customs union into a UK customs union territory. So, I mean, I can see a way that they could develop a simplified document, if it's an exit summary document or something similar, to capture the information, the data that they need. But certainly, it would seem to me that from a UK point of view, it's certainly from the point of view of them protecting their internal market. They're going to want to need something that tells them, that traces the goods, because again, that exit summary declaration is something which would be submitted into the HMRC system at the moment, the chief system. So I don't think it's a case of it's a piece of paper that you just stick in a file and you forget about it.
Yeah.
It goes into the system.
Because that's what just people are asking me this week. So what happens when this EU document, the exit summary declaration, is it filed to a customs office in Cairnryan, and then they say, well, this has nothing to do with us, or do they,
I would expect that it is lodged formally into the customs system, the chief system. I mean, I don't think they're going to develop a completely new customs system for Northern Ireland, so it'll be a bolt-on or maybe a different form, something maybe a lighter touch. But I think I can see a rationale as to why you would want to have it, particularly from a UK protection of their internal market. So
it would seem that it's the notion that there will be absolutely nothing new NI to GB does not look sustainable.
Where there's a will, there's a way, but it's difficult to see it in terms of, I mean, I think it's already quite a divergence and sort of a bespoke system that could work for Northern Ireland, which is moving quite a bit away from normal EU customs rules and UK customs rules. So I think to say it's nothing at all, I think that would be difficult to see how they could do that.
Katy, can I just pick up something with you? So this is all to be sorted out in the joint committee. So it's them who will have to crunch through the technical detail to see what derogations and mitigations we could get. What is the joint committee? Who will sit on it? What will its terms of reference be? What will Northern Ireland's input into that be in particular? How much of this do we know?
So there's a lot that we don't know, and you're right to pick up on the importance of the joint committee. So this is basically the highest level body that will be overseeing the implementation of the withdrawal agreement, and it's a UK-EU body. In terms of Northern Ireland's input into it, zilch. And this is crucial because, in effect, in this deal, it becomes the management body, if you like, for this withdrawal agreement. It takes on much more responsibility than it was going to have in the previous version of the withdrawal agreement. And in that previous version, it was only due to sit once a year, and that hasn't been really considered for this withdrawal agreement as to quite how much more work it's going to be responsible for. And as you're right to point out, essentially so much from this withdrawal agreement in terms of the detail and what will be required and derogations and specifics about what goods will be classified as being at risk, for example, all of that will be decided by this joint committee.
And are we talking, like, is this ministerial level? Is it official level? Do we know yet?
So this is ministerial level, but of course it will have expert committees feeding into it. That's what we would anticipate anyway. The specialised committee overseeing the implementation of this protocol in particular, that would be at the level of officials. But so, again, there's no, this is UK-EU.
Yeah.
So although the EU has said for the specialised committee overseeing the protocol at official level, that the Irish Civil Service will have seats at the table, we don't know the same thing for Northern Ireland. So I think this is something that is a point that should be raised and being made at this stage.
So the governance structure is kind of, so you have a specialised committee of officials, they will report into the joint committee, which is the highest level.
The decisions, yeah.
And we are not yet clear of what Northern Ireland's point of influence or personnel will be on the specialised committee.
Yes, so that hasn't been spelled out at all.
Yeah.
And then we have the Joint Consultative Working Group, which is still to be defined properly. And there's a lot of scope there. I would try and view it as, in a positive way, and that the fact that it's very not spelled out at the moment gives us opportunity to really make a case for
this Joint Consultative Group, that's another level?
That's below the specialised committee.
And who is that? Do we know yet?
No, we don't know yet.
Okay, but Northern Ireland could potentially have representation there?
Yes, that would make a lot of sense. So in theory, that body would be influenced by or connected to or receive information from the institutions of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, which gives a lot of scope, I think, for proper representation of Northern Ireland views. And indeed, you could make case for stakeholder input, particularly from business, into that Joint Consultative Working Group. I think there's a lot of scope there. But because of the significance of the decisions being made, I think especially at the joint committee level, this is why we need much more detail on that. Too much has been made of the fact that the UK or indeed the EU could veto decisions at the joint committee level. That's not enough. We need much more satisfaction with regards to Northern Ireland representation on all of these bodies.
So, even in terms of when you look at, there's so many different strands to be working out here. One is around the consent issue, obviously, and that's a hugely sort of sensitive political issue. But even on the technical level alone, obviously the more bespoke you get, and this is a fairly unprecedented bespoke solution for just on customs alone, before you get into VAT and anything else, you start to see very quickly that the more bespoke you get, the time constraints start to rub up very quickly.
So I hope, Hazel, that we answered some, if you're here, I hope we answered some of your question there. That is the big one. And I think there's also a question here from Paul Eakin from Pelican Healthcare, which is in a similar sort of territory, which kind of takes us through a real-world situation he could face. So in his business, manufacturing Cardiff for some European and other international territories, but sell through Northern Ireland premises. So these goods are transported Cardiff to Cumber and then to the European customer. So do we have any feel for the regulatory framework, the customs framework that is going to apply to that movement for GB, NI, EU?
Does it say what the product is? Medical devices. So it's not agri-food, but it's a highly regulated sector. And because it's something that presumably interacts with regulated bodies here, I think the difference, and I'd have to go back and double check, compare it to the original backstop, but I think under the backstop in the original withdrawal agreement, Northern Ireland certifications, bodies that were basically certifying equipment from Northern Ireland were going to be automatically recognized, I think, by the EU. I'm not 100% sure if that has been carried over as such. It won't be obviously subject to the same level of regulatory controls that any agri-food products were. And the UK is saying that it will align, Northern Ireland will align to the EU's rules on that, but it will depend effectively on what the future relationship of whether we continue to align and are sort of regulated by the European Medicines Agency as well. So it's a little bit of it depends there.
Yeah. And I think my understanding of the original backstop, if you like, was one of the things which business particularly liked, is that some of those kind of regulatory rules could be done from Northern Ireland for a pan-EU basis. So effectively, we would still, say in pharmaceuticals, have the approved person for batch release and things like that, which would be useful, and that should hopefully still be there. I might just throw it open to the floor for a second. We have tons more questions. Alan Bridle sent in an essay, so we'll try and come to some of his stuff in a minute. Does anybody want to stick their hand up and ask a question, or will I start crunching through what Alan has? Gentleman here at the front.
Hi, Billy Moore, Henderson Group. We've touched a bit on no deal will always be there, and let's assume the withdrawal agreement for 1 second does get through, or a version of it, and how the backstop has been removed from that, and this is now all about a trade agreement and everything coming to the front rather than being back-ended. I suppose my question is, we get into the discussions and we get to December 20, and is the likelihood of a no deal less for NI, because can the NI protocol kick in at that point, or do we crash out?
No, I mean, so in a sense, Northern Ireland would be, if the trade agreement isn't wrapped up, from the point of view of its relationship with the EU, in a better position than the rest of the UK, certainly for trade across the land border, but not so much necessarily in terms of you would have all of the, as currently drafted, controls and documentary requirements kicking in for trade with the UK, and I would like to say unless the UK takes a series of standalone commitments, but that is not sufficient, because obviously even if the UK were to, in legislation, make a commitment to align, you'd really need an agreement with the EU. So what I've been sort of looking at potentially is, could the UK commit to, if it's not going to extend the transition, could it commit to the EU that effectively that it will continue to follow the rules that Northern Ireland is covered by under this new front stop, to avoid those new controls kicking in internally within the UK market. But that in itself, then, you almost get to the point of saying it's so complicated to work that out, you might as well extend the transition. But at least from the point of view of trade with the EU, Northern Ireland would be in a better position than the rest of the UK.
Yeah. So this has kind of been framed, I think, in some circles as no deal for GB, but deal for Northern Ireland in that scenario you described.
I suppose, I mean, one point would be, the deal, the Northern Ireland Protocol deal, obviously deals with goods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So no deal for GB could still mean no deal for services. In a wider context, I know services is maybe less, affected by all of this, but there are still potential no deal issues there. So that could be a real mess, but certainly in terms of goods, as Ali said, it's the front stops there.
Interestingly, on services, depending on what sector you're in, financial services probably is exempted from that, not in a good way because it's so harmonized in terms of EU law, but because once you're out of the EU and certainly out of the transition period of alignment and continued ease of market access, services are a much more nebulous, I think, thing to plan for, because it basically, you default back to, it depends on which country you're trading with. The rules can change so significantly outside of financial services, because there's whereas I think for the internal market, for the single market in goods, there's a uniform level of sort of set of measures laid down if you're sort of trading with the EU as a third country. That changes once you're out of the EU and out of the single market, and it really depends on which country you're trading with. So I would anticipate in that situation that in a number of areas, potentially the UK, for the perspective of Northern Ireland, would be looking to try and work out certain arrangements bilaterally with Ireland in the areas that it's entitled to be able to do when it comes to services.
Frankie, just while I remember, in broad strokes, what does this deal actually say and mean for VAT, so much as you can tell?
I thought we'd moved on there, John. Sidestep that one. Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot in the protocol. There's only about 3 or 4 paragraphs on VAT, so I mean, in terms of trying to work through it, my general sense is, although there's still a lot of detail to work through in terms of operationally how it would work, I actually don't see a significant problem with the VAT as such. It could be different. I mean, if you look at, say, Northern Ireland to Republic of Ireland, it'll be much the same. Okay, it might be called an export, but it's effectively much the same, fill in the same boxes pretty much. I think it does say that Northern Ireland companies would continue to complete VEES forms, EC sales forms. So effectively it is sort of saying, you're still treated as if you're, an EU country selling to another EU country, perhaps. So that's what companies are used to in that sense. So I don't think there's a big issue on that. In terms of this sort of confusing bit where it's saying Northern Ireland would in some cases may apply a reduced rate or an exemption that may apply in the Republic of Ireland depending on level playing field, I think it's quite confusing in terms of how that might play out and where it might actually be relevant. But I think in terms of, I suppose, just looking at a situation where maybe the UK diverges significantly from what the EU VAT rules are currently. So from that point of view, is there a situation where that upsets the all-island economy, perhaps, in terms of level playing field, in terms of, and again, this is in relation to supplies of goods. So in terms of that, that could mean that Northern Ireland maybe would change a rate, and obviously under EU rules, you specifically, you can't have a reduced rate less than 5%, you can't have a standard rate more than 15%. So if the UK decided to go a different way on that, Northern Ireland may have to, for goods, stay within the EU framework. The big bit, I think, and just to finish off on that point, which is obviously relevant for Northern Ireland, obviously the tourism sector is a big one. I'm not sure if there's anyone in from tourism, but you would have thought that the most important thing for tourism in Northern Ireland was to say we will have a level playing field with the Republic of Ireland, so you've got this 13.5% rate in the south. But tourism is a service, and this,
not in the scope,
this relates to goods. So again, it's maybe a missed opportunity, or maybe there's scope down the line to try and actually do something which is actually relevant and meaningful in terms of that level playing field piece.
Yeah, well, so if you start to maybe establish the principle that should be a level playing field in VAT on goods, then can you start to nudge it towards services in your favour as well?
It's also worth noting that, which may not seem like it sort of has an effect right away, but that because the UK would be implementing the rules, but the rules would be EU in terms of how they apply to VAT. That means that for VAT purposes, as far as I can understand it, Northern Ireland would still be bound by the European Court of Justice rulings on VAT. And there are a lot of rulings on VAT. Literally, I've never seen every sort of cases about derogations, exemptions. So it's certainly something that, in terms of different rulings in respect of VAT, that businesses in Northern Ireland would have to certainly try and pay attention to, because there would be a different rulings in the rest of the UK to what Northern Ireland is being affected by.
Yeah, so we can probably be pretty clear there's lots of work in this for lawyers, Adrian. Just while I'm mentioning lots of work for lawyers, you're leading the contracts unit at Tughans. In terms of companies starting to look towards the point at which the environment will change, which is supposed to be, although we don't think it will be, it's supposed to be in December 2020. For contracts signed ahead of that period, what are the implications going to be in terms of amending or renegotiating? What exactly should people be looking out for, and what might happen?
Okay, look, thank you for that. What is clear from what we're talking about so far is that this debate is still framed in economic terms, in political terms. The lawyers haven't yet been let loose, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it also means that we're sitting back and watching. For our clients, they're focusing on the operational impacts, and so the lawyers yet haven't been given free rein, as I say. So what you're asking me, the questions that the clients are asking about their contracts, they're distinguishing existing contracts and new contracts. So the existing contracts, by their nature, are already in place, they're already booked, but that's what the value of their business depends on. To what extent are they secure? So you're revisiting those and trying to overlay the issues that we're discussing on this stage onto those contracts, things like delivery terms, things like pricing. So, you're trying to ensure that the underpinning bargain is not affected for your client, and that's not always the case. Whenever you're looking then forward into new contracts, it's much more difficult, because you're asking your client to plan for Brexit, but plan for what? And the tools that the lawyers are using at the moment are essentially pretty blunt. They're trying to define what the trigger is, and the consequence of that trigger is perhaps negotiation, renegotiation, or perhaps termination, but that's not always going to suit. Mm-hmm. So at the moment, the lawyers are sitting back, poised, but the debate continues on the economic and and political level. I find myself just not being an economist, not being a politician, viewing it as a citizen like everybody else. Again, trying to find the positives, and you can see some of them in terms of an all-island regulatory zone, trying to understand the problems that are going to present themselves whenever we diverge in terms of customs. And you can't help but feeling we're looking for that specific Northern Ireland solution, the best of both worlds, but I can't help feeling that's what Dr. Frankenstein was looking for as well.
And I assume that you have been writing lots of Brexit clauses into contracts for some time now.
Yeah.
Yeah. And are they generally just saying, if this happens, we'll have to talk, or is it?
That would be the first protocol,
yeah.
and at the back end of it, well, do we walk away from this relationship? Mm-hmm. And again, that will also talk to the fundamental bargaining power of both parties as and when that negotiation happens. And that can change through the course of a contract, but it comes back to the point that you send your lawyers in to add value. The value is by security of contract, and those kind of clauses just ride roughshod over that.
Can I ask a question, actually?
Sure, by all means, yeah.
Because one of the things that we often, when we're doing sort of Brexit planning events up and down the UK, is talk about sort of clauses that might be inserted to cover territorial scope. So the idea that basically if there's a reference to the EU, therefore the UK is no longer part of the EU. Is that something that's frequently featuring in commercial contracts that you're finding, or not particularly in terms of needing to change that territorial scope?
There are certain clauses that will address it, but again, very generically. But it is one of those areas that you're going to have a laser focus on. As I mentioned pricing, I mentioned delivery terms, change of control, but also legislative references. What's going to happen there? So at the moment, there'll be something rather bland in terms of any replacement or successive legislation, and that could be flexed to try and address the issue. But equally, if you've got a governing law, which is in the EU, or a governing jurisdiction, which is within the EU, and you suddenly find yourself outside of that, these are issues. We're no longer going to be party to the Treaty of Rome, which was dictating laws and jurisdiction. We're going to have to plot a new course.
I will come to one of Alan Bridle's questions now. And good to have two people who were involved in the official alternative arrangements outfit. Do you think that any of the alternative arrangements suggested to mitigate the potential disruption in the land border have the potential to be applied or repurposed for the sea border? Allie or Katy?
Yeah. I have to say, if I'm being brutally honest, when I was on the... I'm not going to talk about it in the past tense, because in theory it's still going. Right. But it was always a possibility that we weren't just talking about the land border, but also sea border. And that's, bearing in mind that a lot of the proposals put forward or considered work on a maritime border. It's much more difficult to manage customs across a land border, especially a hard border like that. So just to put it as simply as possible, I wrote a paper on weighing up alternative arrangements, and there's three things that we need to bear in mind with managing a border. The first is that you know what's crossing. The second thing is that you know what's entering your territory is allowed to or complies with the conditions for doing so. And then thirdly, that you can block entry if needs be. And all of that is much more easy to manage on the sea border than the land border. Especially obviously blocking entry, but also knowing what is crossing, and being able then to check those goods that are crossing. So technological solutions, which sort of come at the very end of all of that, are merely a means of facilitating those processes, and they operate. It's possible to operate them more efficiently and effectively where you have very clearly defined points of entry, of course, and that's what you do have when you're dealing with ports and airports. So in theory, yes, and especially the things that we kept hearing about in terms of obviously trusted trader schemes, etc. Those can work fairly, efficiently in that context of managing that type of border. So I do think there's scope for considering them, and it is worth pressing on this question as to how alternative arrangements those kind of means of facilitating customs, etc., might be managed on the sea border.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were one of the things that I think came out of that was very important, particularly from an agri-food perspective, was that, and I'm referencing things that were in the public domain in any event, I remember there being a discussion about could you have, for the land border, roaming sort of mobile SPS checks for agri-food products, and that was just a non-starter for the agri-food industry. Not just, and I think that was an important thing for government to realize, not just in respect of the fact that the EU, by its own law, you had to have, for sort of health, safety, and security reasons, controls on products of animal origin being done at the land border, but also from a customer reputational point of view. I think that was a really important thing that came out in a lot of our discussions, was that from the land border perspective, certainly, that if you couldn't demonstrate to your customer in the south, for example, in the Republic, that you had that sort of control done at the border, you would effectively have no market there. And so I think that was a really important thing to come out. Certain other things, I think, like, for example, talking about the use of transit. I don't want to go into too much detail, but the idea of transit, which has also been used potentially in a no-deal scenario, that basically allows you to suspend multiple sort of payments of duty each time it crosses the border. I wouldn't say that would necessarily apply in the sea border, because the whole point there is that you're having to cross the land border more than one time. So that was particularly, I think, actually more relevant for looking at it in a sort of land border scenario rather than at the sea. Because effectively the point is that you're not supposed to have to pay tariffs at all between GB and I, and certainly north and south.
And if we think about the use of trusted trader schemes, which was a key part of, if you like, the provisional alternative arrangements group, and you could see a situation, so we're in this scenario with the tariff thing for Northern Ireland. So goods coming in to Northern Ireland, which are to be consumed in Northern Ireland, won't be tariffed. Goods which are at risk of going into the EU will be tariffed. So could you have a situation where you have these trusted traders, and it will always be assumed that they will make sure the correct tariff procedures have been followed all the way down the line? So there needs to be a very light touch involvement with HMRC.
I still think the issue of compliance applies regardless of which direction the products are going in, effectively, because the question being then is that I think there was some discussion actually in this protocol about exemptions and people sort of declaring themselves depending on whether their product was staying in the UK or moving on to the EU. And one of the issues I think for that in a trusted trader context is new products come to the market all the time, new routes come to the market all the time. There's never a sort of static approach to how any one trader or business trades with either the rest of the UK or the rest of the EU. Things may change very rapidly, and I think that's the sort of big question that I had, that I think the Joint Committee will have to, because effectively what has been proposed for Northern Ireland under this protocol for customs is the resurrected part of what the UK government under Theresa May initially proposed for the whole of the UK to avoid a customs union, which was originally it was the facilitated customs arrangement, the FCA, and then it sort of morphed into what was called the NCP, the New Customs Partnership. But both, broadly speaking, it was a dual tariff approach. And then initially there was an issue about tracking, so figuring out what was the movement of goods that were staying in the UK versus going on to the EU. That product journey tends not to be static all the time, and so I think that's a relevant challenge regardless of what land border it is.
Yeah. And actually, Jim Hora from HMRC, who was giving evidence this week, he seems to suggest that tracking was not going to be a big feature of whatever was planning, that it was going to be basically done on almost a purely administrative basis, that the notion of trying to track something right the way through the supply chain was impossible. Yeah. So
what he puts in place to completely absent the need for that, I'm not sure, if I'm honest.
Have you any ideas, Frankie, how they might work this administratively?
I can think that there are probably obvious examples of where you could move goods GB to NI, which you think, well, they're not going to be moved on. So supermarkets, for example.
So my example I've been using for people all week is to say, right, Sainsbury's doesn't operate in the Republic. So if you have a pallet load of Sainsbury's orange juice, that's clearly going to be consumed in Northern Ireland. Sainsbury's do not have a motivation to start smuggling orange juice into the Republic of Ireland.
Small traders who have dynamic journeys, though.
And you probably can sort of ring fence that around a trusted trader type system of
in that
checking
supply
as well.
chain, yeah.
Yeah.
But that is the big boys. That is, I think it's much more difficult when you're looking at people who are trading both B2B and B2C in a much smaller context, who may have lots of different, a new business may arise, and so it's a lot harder to actually manage that for the smaller traders, which is where the compliance issue always existed.
Yeah. And then the flip side of that, the other example I've been using is, say, a commodity product where there's likely to be a tariff involved, say like Chinese steel. So if I'm a steel stockholder, these goods come in from GB to Northern Ireland, I might operate on an all-island basis. There is every possibility these goods will end up in the Republic. So you've got to think in that scenario, that importer is going to be having to pay the tariff. And then let's say the steel then is shown to be consumed in Northern Ireland, sold to a Northern Ireland end user. Do we have any sense of what will the process be for claiming your rebate?
I don't think it got into that level of detail, did it?
No, I don't think that there is. I mean, obviously we know the principle of how it could work.
Yeah.
If it comes into the UK, into Northern Ireland, then I suppose, the UK tariff would apply unless it moves on, and then in which case the EU tariff, may apply. But in terms of how you would track that, I certainly haven't seen anything in terms of how they would police that.
And you have to remember where it potentially becomes a little bit even trickier is when you have defensive tariffs and safeguards. So basically there are EU rules that are being applied to, I presume, that there is, so basically particularly around raw materials like steel, but also we've seen the trade war going on between the EU and the US, that sometimes very often tariffs, defensive reactive tariffs are put up on products not even related to the original anti-dumping duty that has attracts an anti-dumping sort of safeguard measure. So understanding how those differences in respect of if the UK and the EU are not aligned in applying defensive duties on certain products, that makes it an extra layer of complication. Not widespread, but in certain select areas.
But do we get any sense of the volume of goods and the sorts of goods which people in this room may be bringing in from GB every day? What sort of percentage of goods is likely to be affected, is likely to fall within the at-risk scope?
I would think a significant proportion. I mean, even just speaking to people at different health clinics that we're running around Northern Ireland this week, and they could be a big business, they could be a micro business, but a lot of them are sourcing materials from GB, coming into NI, and then they do something with it. Maybe not an awful lot, and it moves on somewhere to a different market outside of Northern Ireland. So it is very significant. I was speaking to somebody outside. They buy a lot of materials from GB into Northern Ireland. They do something with it, and then 80% of it is sold on to the EU, and 20% back to GB. So again, that's an example of a very significant, movement on, but not all of it moves on. So unless you said that business, you look at its sort of sales profile and you say 80% is exported to EU, and therefore we're going to say that all of your goods are at risk, and then you basically have to get the rebate for the 20% that you sell back to GB, maybe. Yeah. That's all the joint committee and operationally how they'll define this at risk.
I think there was a piece of very useful research which the Department for Economy did, I think, last year, where they actually looked at where Northern Ireland manufacturers source their intermediates, and far and away it all comes from GB. I think timber comes from the EU, mainly coming in, like Finnish or Baltic timber coming in through Warren Point, but mostly everything else, intermediate-wise, is GB. So that is, I think the Joint Committee have to get this right, or it's an issue for manufacturing. Huge issue.
Interestingly, I remember when we were first looking at what had been proposed, the government had proposed for under the Chequers arrangement for this kind of dual tariff idea. There was a huge piece of work that needed to be done on figuring out the sort of difference between the finished and the intermediate goods and which was going where. And I imagine that's going to be an extra piece of work. And I think there is an argument. There are some people who I saw on social media saying, well, obviously, people who didn't like the level of bureaucracy that was potentially going to be appended to this for the whole of the UK were quite happy to have it appended to Northern Ireland, and the argument being that actually it was on a smaller scale, but that's not really how that works. The scale is almost irrelevant. It's the sort of the structures that need to be put in place are complex regardless of the scope of the products in terms of overall that it's going to. And as has just been said, I think it's particularly higher in this part of the UK than the rest.
Okay, anybody else from the floor? Oh, there's loads. We'll take this lady in the middle.
Hi, Kathy, the People Navigator. So, getting it back to the human level and the people side of things, what advice would you have for employers who are having conversations with worried EU national employees who are maybe loyal, long-serving? What advice would you have for them?
Well, I mean, the first one is obviously around settled status. It's really important. I think it's easy for people who are working on this every day to forget that not everyone is working on it every day. And so I'm always reminded of that when I do a lot of the planning events around the UK, when I get heart palpitations that some people have never heard of settled status or don't think that they're going to apply for it anytime soon. And I think that the reason for that is that because there is a lack of clear understanding from both the employer and the employee side about what is involved with that process. I have heard many employees saying that they know so little about it that they think that if they raise it, they're at risk for being...
So just in case people don't realise, settled status, what is it?
So it's basically it's the scheme for people who are EU nationals who are in the UK before the cutoff point, which ends at the end of next year, I believe. I think it's December, not June. I'll have to double check, but I'm fairly sure it's the end of next year. And it allows you basically, because your free movement rights will end, because this government is still committed to ending free movement, that allows you to basically have, it's your legal basis for staying in the UK after Brexit. And a lot of employees seem to be fearful of talking about it with their employers. They think that somehow that they're at risk of being deported after Brexit, and I kid you not, that is something that is brought up very frequently. And similarly, some employers feel nervous about talking about it because they don't know if that instigates any financial obligations on the employer's side, and it's not the case at all. It really is a very straightforward process, and so we're really sort of encouraging people to try and apply for that sooner rather than later, so that it's not a worried rush at the end.
And in terms of the process and what employers can do to help with that?
Well, so for example, there are different types of settled status. It's worth noting there's the pre-settled status, depending on how long you have been in the UK and what documents you have to show. Sometimes the employee will get pre-settled status, and they'll think that's sort of sufficient. They don't need anything else. When in fact that means there's an issue potentially if you as the employee go away for a few years and come back, that starts all over again, and you won't have access to that same settled status. So we're trying to educate employers about what the difference in the types of settled statuses to help employees understand what those different types are, to really try and go for the full one if they can, if possible. But also in terms of understanding the documentary requirements, they're actually fairly straightforward. And it's worth we have certainly on the IoD's guidance a lot of information about what that involves. It is a very straightforward process, but it's really important for MDs, HR directors to be sitting down and talking about it with their EU nationals who may be employees. And sometimes people don't know, if you have dual citizenship, does that entitle to you? It's worth doing, I hate to put it as bluntly as an audit, but an audit of your workforce to make sure you know who may need to get it sooner rather than later.
Could I just add, I'm not going to try and answer your question, but we are running Brexit clinics afterwards, and from KPMG we have an immigration lawyer, so I'm sure he can talk to you about any of your specific questions. And we're running clinics on other issues as well, trade and customs, but if your issue is people, then we've got the man for you, Philip McNally. So
he's very good. Another hand? Yeah.
Thank you. Ivor Ferguson from the Ulster Farmers Union, and on one previous question, it was asked here from the floor that in a no-deal situation, Northern Ireland might be in a slightly better position. But I just want to point out from a farming point of view, the UK is such a big market for us, and 70 to 80% of what we produce goes there. And if GB mainland moved away on a regulatory basis so much from us, that they would have less regulations, their cost of production on the UK mainland then, or GB mainland then, would be therefore less, but we would still be aligned to the EU, so our cost of production would be more. So from a practical point of view and trading point of view, we would certainly be at a very big disadvantage.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's important, as I stressed earlier, to say that that's only in respect of access to the EU market, and that you still have the issues that apply very quickly in terms of the internal market differences.
There's certainly some more hands. Where else are we? Yeah, lady over here.
Susan Hayes-Cullerton, the Positive Economist. I don't expect the panel to be able to answer me technically on this, but I just want to ask it broadly. In the context of financial services, if we could niche down on the funds industry, particularly the UCITS regulation, for example, has been a critical factor in terms of the way in which people invest their money across the EU from a retail and institutional point of view. How do you think that the City of London is going to react from a funds point of view in either the event of a no deal or the proposed deal at the moment?
Anybody fancy a go at that one? Do we have a financial services lawyer in the room?
I want to say it. I mean, it depends on what the UK does in respect of, so there are different scenarios, obviously. In a no-deal scenario, are they going to vastly sort of diverge right away, necessarily, or are they not? And I think a lot of it will depend on that point, but it's probably worth picking up. Certainly, I'm happy to pick up after the panel.
I think that's as good as you're going to get on that one. Anybody else? Gentleman here. And also, I would say, just to add on that, because I know that at least in a cross-border NI to sort of ROI and vice versa, I know that the Irish government has been putting in place a lot of omnibus sort of contingency legislation for no deal around, I think, including financial services. So a lot will depend also on, it's more difficult because financial services there is a lot of harmonized EU law there, but there's also a lot of individual member state law. So to a certain extent, it will also depend on the arrangements between, or the collaboration between the Irish government and the British government to a certain extent.
Hi, Gary Wilmot, Kilwater Minerals. I have a controversial question, but it may have a very short answer. Can the panel think of any positives or any upsides from the direction of travel at the minute?
As in the whole Brexit process?
Yeah, particularly for the Northern Ireland economy. Is there anything that the economy here has to gain from the current direction of travel?
I mean, you could make a case, but then it really depends on which sector you're talking about and their interlinkages with GB. You could make a case that from an investment point of view, because of at least its fairly unfettered access south and to the rest of the EU, that's a potential pull point for investment. But again, that would really depend on whether that's sort of an isolated link into the EU and you have no interlinkages depending on the sector you're in with the rest of the UK.
Yeah, just reading through it this week, what occurred to me was one opportunity for Northern Ireland might be if we, and again, subject to the comments that you have, to position ourselves as the UK arm of an EU-wide supply chain. So, we sell ourselves as that. So, let's go and talk to Nissan, see if they're interested in building their cars here. And therefore, we have that goods access. But we'll obviously need to resolve our east-west.
Katy, any thoughts on that?
No, I just concur with that. It's all about the east-west and what that's going to look like.
Yeah, and I think the Northern Ireland Department for Economy, again, did some research, which they suggested in the sort of scenario we're looking like we're going to have, you could get an increase in FDI investment in manufacturing, because certainly, you have that, in automotive, in other highly regulated sectors like pharmaceuticals, that kind of model is something. But they also then said that it would potentially have a negative impact on services.
Yeah.
And then that there's...
Because a lot of goods are traded with services, and if they're not covered...
And there is actually an excellent piece published just today by an economist called Michael Gezerek, who is at the University of Sussex. It's only about 2 pages, and the headline is, "Better than the status quo for Northern Ireland, ? Not quite so simple." And he basically is in the same sort of territory as well. And the other point he makes around, and I think this is an important one on the consent piece, is if you are going to market Northern Ireland as the, if you like, as you say, the EU, the UK arm of EU supply chains, it's about the sustainability of that.
How quickly does that change?
Yeah, so it's the question being asked, well, is this for 4 years or is this for life? So again, the consent mechanism starts to feature in there as well. And this was always an area when the backstop was talked about as the best of both worlds. Something I had to keep saying was, well, if you're claiming the backstop is only going to be temporary, is it an investment proposition? And then the same, I think, would apply in this, but not in quite such an acute way.
Yeah, I mean, and I think even also to pick up that point, even from a parking the investment, inward investment question, is a trader, particularly in the goods space, going to find that it has every 4 years to figure out whether it wants to prioritize the GB market over the Republic of Ireland market? That's not it's a slightly invidious position to be in.
From your business's point of view, do you get any sense of potential upsides?
Well, our markets are predominantly UK and Ireland, so...
Yep. I'll tell you, yes, okay.
It depends.
Anybody else?
There's someone in the back.
Is there somebody? Yes, just at the very back here.
Thank you. George Ong, Northern Ireland Water. Great panel, great discussion. My question's around the contracts. We would have quite a few contracts of a variety, chemicals, equipment, services, and so is the country that you have to sign the contract and the legislation. Is it UK or is it Northern Ireland or is it Ireland? What will all that you have discussed so far have an implication on what we write down there in terms of if there's any dispute of the contract, which country will it be?
What's your venue, basically?
Look, there's the legal answer to that, and there's the practical answer to that. You write contracts with a view to never actually bringing them anywhere near a court. And if you're not writing them, you're talking to the wrong lawyer that way. 999 contracts out of 1,000 never see a court. So what you're doing there is trying to position yourself that if an argument does arise, you can put your best foot forward in terms of either asserting your position correctly or else making their position difficult. And one of the ways you can make their position difficult is by saying, okay, if you want to litigate this, you come and play away from home in my jurisdiction. So therefore, that would always argue for you playing at home and allowing them to play away. That's the practical answer. In terms of the legal answer, you're right. The local laws may have something to say about the particular issue at hand. So it's not just a matter of rather blasé entering into contracts governed by other countries' laws, because you could very easily find yourself come a cropper if you don't understand custom and practice in that local jurisdiction. So that will require the efforts of a local lawyer to guide you. Oftentimes that's seen as an additional resource that companies can't simply afford. So to this extent you can argue hard for playing at home.
Okay. I have a quick question for Katy here, which is just about the timing issue, and you may have touched upon it slightly earlier. In terms of the EU's budget process, and in terms of potential further extensions, what is the latest date they see for Brexit without the whole budgetary issue having to be reopened?
June next year.
Right. Mm-hmm. So, and the question that sort of leads on from that for me is, so if we're in this position of saying, right, we're not going to get an election this year probably, and there may have to be another extension in the new year. Mm-hmm. Could you be in a scenario where the UK will have to say, listen, due to the Fixed Term Parliament Act, we're going to need a really long extension because otherwise we can't guarantee we'll have an election?
I would say, just as a quick NB, I saw before I came up on here the Chancellor Sajid Javid saying that the government would continue to keep bringing election motion after election motion regardless of what happens to it. So you have to wonder if one of those times they end up being successful or not.
So is there still a potential out there for a really long extension even with that budgetary complication?
I think when you say, could there be a scenario in which, the answer is yes, regardless of the way you finish that sentence.
But then what you have to remember, obviously, that it's a flex tension all the time, isn't it? So at any point, if a deal was passed, it would be cancelled out.
It could be if they determine that when they're making that decision, yes. I can't see a situation in which we go... I think to be brutally honest, at some point the EU is better prepared for no deal than the UK, and it would hurt the UK more, and that calculation could be made, and Macron was seriously considering it a year or so ago. So in the situation where the UK, if you have this, basically a non-functioning parliament and government, as Ali was saying, and you have an indecision about, the Brexit deal, etc., then we are seriously looking at a no deal,
So I think we have time for one more question, and then I might just go down the panel and ask them to give us a closing pearl of wisdom each. Anybody else? Did we have somebody? Well, the pearls of wisdom.
Question here.
Yep. Had one somewhere down here, did we? Yep. Where were we?
Might have just been right.
No.
Sorry,
typing
I'm
on his
going
phone.
mad. Sorry. Right. In that case, I will ask for a closing pearl of wisdom, be it a good piece of advice or a prediction, whatever you like. And I'll just start with Allie and go down the line.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say I think it's obviously much more challenging for businesses in Northern Ireland. Having said that, in terms of planning, not to waste extensions and transitions and letting it get to the end to plan, because the people that you'll probably need to plan will be all tapped out. So it's just a plea and an appeal to, I think sometimes it can be very overwhelming and very all-consuming. But anyone who's certainly, you know, if you're a member of the IoD, there's a huge amount of guidance that we put together to help support you through that. So, and really being able to proactively plan now and figure out, even if it's something as basic as understanding your supply chains, your suppliers, your customers, things will be relevant for things like rules of origin, down the line in a free trade agreement, what have you. The more that you know about your supply chain, the better stead you'll be to be able to actually own and manage the disruption if it comes yourself.
Frankie?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with all of that. And on top of that as well, the whole issue of Incoterms, terms of trade. I think, I mean, during the clinics that we've been talking to business about, I mean, a lot of the time Incoterms, terms of trade, they're not really that well known because it maybe hasn't been an issue. So I think people need to plan ahead for, okay, well, if we were in this scenario, no deal, or, you know, I'm selling my goods from Northern Ireland to the Republic of Ireland, it's all straightforward at the minute. What's going to change? Am I delivering duty paid? Who's got the responsibility to pay the duty, to do the importation? So there's a lot of issues around that, just understanding that simple supply chain and making sure that, you know, you're getting ahead of it, because, like, businesses were talking to us 2 weeks ago saying, okay, I think I need an Irish VAT number, I need an EORI number, I need a broker. All of those things, now that seems to be kicked down the road a bit, but maybe now the time is to, you know, get ahead of those issues and put some sort of structure in place.
And just really briefly on that, sorry, just to say that there are a lot of awkward conversations that we know that can prompt, but it's better to have them in a calm situation than an overly fraught situation down the line.
Katy?
I think you mentioned at the very beginning about Brexit being a process, and I think it's worth being clear about your priorities and things that you most want to protect through the process of Brexit. And it is particularly at a moment of flux at the moment, and it's probably worth making most of this moment to kind of make your views known and to be clear about if you have concerns, and to lobby and to kind of make a bit of an impact at the moment about the details of this agreement, because there is so much yet to be decided on all of this.
Adrian?
Rather childlike plea to politicians to just stop playing the man and start playing the ball.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough, and I think it is. So to come back to something we have said here, if there is a deal which is going to look like the one that's on the table at the moment, there is clearly an awful lot to play for in terms of the Northern Ireland business community, and I'm sure people are bored and fatigued by this process by now, but it's like you're going to all have to rouse yourselves again and absolutely push so hard, because this is the moment where, if these trading arrangements are for life across the Irish Sea, they need to be got right, and they will only be got right if people keep the pressure on and actually push the politicians to make sure they're going to work for you and your businesses. So thank you very much, Allie, Katy, Frankie and Adrian. Big round of applause. Thank you for all the staff at the Hilton. Thank you for the audiovisual staff. For anybody seeking further advice on Brexit in your business, we have experts still on hand. Feel free to visit the experts from KPMG outside and the Brexit Ready NI stand. You can also email brexit.readyni@iod.com to get free tailored advice, probably coming from Allie, for your business. So if there's plenty of people around, if you need more bespoke advice, please use this opportunity now. Thank you very much.